making a Victorian corset from scratch, based on an original pattern from 1877. Sadly, my old corset is slowly deteriorating, so it's time to make a new one. This project had quite a few plot twists for me. Initially, I wanted to make this 1884 satin corset using a navy blue satin that I had in my stash. I then proceeded to scale and rescale the pattern until I figured out the sizing. Then I cut out the fabric, basted all of the lining to the satin, and sewed everything together until I ended up with this. To be fair, it's not terrible, but I wasn't convinced that I could turn this into a corset that actually looks the way I had envisioned, and I couldn't figure out the exact placement of the boning channels either. I had also flatlined this corset, assuming that the bones would go on the seams, but would they? I decided to start over from scratch. I might still finish this corset up someday.
Someday. It's a dangerous word.
Dangerous?
This is really just code for never.
But I think I might have bitten off more than I could chew with a corset that requires gussets. So, as I said, we're starting over with the other pattern I had considered, this 1877 corset of couture. Only straightforward vertical seams, well, nobody could call these seams straight, and it is quite clear from this pattern that the boning will have to go on the seams of the corset, which means that I can safely flatline it without any trouble. But now, without any further ado, let's get started, again. The pattern I'm using is the 1877 corset of couture, found in the De Gracieuse magazine, and I found a whole collection of original corset patterns from this magazine online called clusterfrock.com, which I'll link down below for you, and I will also link the specific patterns that I used directly, as well as a scaled up version to original size. They have decades worth of corset patterns from this magazine, so that's a huge help for all of us who wish to create original Victorian corset designs. So I downloaded the pattern and scaled it up to its original size by measuring the little scale at the bottom, which is supposed to be a square inch, but only 0.38 inches wide in my file. So I divided the image measurement by 0.38 to scale it up. As it turns out, this corset will fit me without any further pattern adjustments, so I can just scale it up to the original pattern size and use the pattern as is. For reference, I'm a UK size 10. Before printing the pattern, it's good to make sure that all of your print settings are set to the actual measurements of the file you're printing. I've had this before, that the print settings kind of scaled the file in a weird way before putting it on paper, so even though the pattern was scaled correctly, it still came out too small on paper, which was a problem I had to fix in my printing settings. So make sure you measure the results at the waistline before you start cutting out the fabric to make sure that everything will fit. I printed the pattern, cut it out, and reassembled it. Before continuing any further, it's important to line up the pieces side by side and measure the waistline to double check that it's going to fit you. These patterns, like many Victorian sewing patterns in general, do not include seam allowance, so we'll have to add that later, but for now it's also very convenient since we can just measure the pattern as is. Keep in mind that the waist measurement for corsets is about 4 inches smaller than your actual waist. For me, I always scale up my corset patterns according to the desired waist measurements, and I will just trust the proportions of the pattern for the bust and hip measurements. Since these corsets are supposed to shape your body in a specific way, I will just trust the corset to do the work for me, and then if it doesn't fit me in the end, I will just have to figure out if I have to add padding or something to fill up the desired shape. Next, I taped the pattern together to create a paper mock-up, and just look at the way the paper pattern pieces bend into a beautiful corset shape without any further support. My body is not shaped like this, but it will be by the time this corset is finished with me. Just kidding. Kind of. This is part of the art of Victorian corsetry, that the very seams of the corset are placed and curved in a way that the corset will assume its shape even without heavy boning. In fact, there were many different types of corsets around throughout the Victorian era, some only lightly boned or corded, and some heavily boned with whalebone. Today we can substitute whalebone for synthetic whalebone or zip ties, as you will see later in this video. When I made my very first corset, I made the mistake of eliminating some of the curves, adjusting them to fit my actual unlaced body measurements, which really spoiled the corset shape. Trust the process, It will fit you even if it looks crazy now. Time to cut out the fabric. I'm using a lilac cotton for my top layer and a heavier white cotton canvas for the lining to provide some extra strength. I had planned to use navy satin initially, but then I really liked the pale lilac, which was originally meant for lining, but I decided to stick with it for my top fabric. The good news is that the cotton doesn't fray nearly as much as the satin would, and will hopefully give me a neater result. As you might have noticed that I added a grain line on each pattern piece in black to make sure I cut the corset out correctly. That is because in the Victorian era, some corsets were cut on a very specific grain, ever so slightly on the bias of the fabric, to achieve a slight stretch and reduce wrinkling along the seams. So I've basted the lilac cotton to my lining fabric, which is a sturdier white cotton, and I've done all of this and I've basted together all of the pieces except for the back piece and the front piece. These two pieces are the only ones that will not be flat-lined completely. They will be flat-lined on the seam that will be attached to the rest of the corset, but we will actually have to attach the front edge of the corset and the back edge of the corset right side, so the edges will have a clean finish and we can iron this nice and flat. Time to start assembling the corset. Part of the fun of flat lining is that we're going to attach the pieces wrong sides together, leaving the raw edge on the outside to be covered with boning channels later. Make sure to follow all of the curves carefully and pin in place. That's because in the Victorian era, corsets were often cut on a very specific grain, ever so slightly on the bias of the fabric, to achieve a slight stretch and reduce wrinkling along the curved seams. I did my best to replicate the original pattern placement. I'm using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on either side, but no seam allowance for the top, as we'll be binding the edges. Then let's sew everything together. The back and front panels will all be pinned to the lining right sides together, and the front and back seams of the corset sewn together. I also understitched the seams, sewing the seam allowance down on the lining side 1/4 inch away from the seam, as this will prevent the lining from rolling up or peeking through. The only piece where I'd recommend to skip the understitching is the front panel that the looped side of the busk is inserted into, as it turned out to be quite a hassle to insert the busk into an understitched seam. Once the back panels are prepared, we can attach them to the corset's wrong sides together like the other pieces. Next, we need to insert the busk. Mark where it goes and where the knobs will appear. and then gently force an opening in the weave of the fabric with a blunt object, such as a knitting needle or a pencil. Though the latter could leave marks, so something that doesn't color the fabric is definitely the better option. And then pass the knobs through it. This can be a little bit tricky, but we don't want to cut the threads of the fabric to avoid fraying and ripping, so it's best to just push the threads away to create an opening like this. For the loop side of the busk, we'll need to unpick a few stitches where each loop will go. And if you have understitched this side as well as I did, then you will need to unpick the understitching and cut a little slit in the seam allowance to allow the busk to pass through. We'll then secure the busk in place by stitching around it with a zipper foot, trapping the busk between the front seam of the corset and the seam we just sewed. Then the front panels can be attached to the corset as well, again wrong sides together. Next, it's important to press all of the seams carefully to make them lie flat, and it's also a very satisfying process. Then the seam allowance can be trimmed down to 1/4 inch. And I've already cut and pressed strips of fabric to make boning channels, which I didn't film unfortunately, and we're now going to attach one to each seam. Again, make sure to follow the curves carefully, and you have two options here. You can use a wider boning material and just one bone per channel, or sew down the middle of each channel and double bone the corset with narrower bones. For boning, you can use synthetic whalebone or zip ties. The stiffness seems to be pretty similar. The ones I'm using today are some we had left over, 7mm and black, but the best option to use are light colored zip ties, as there's less risk of the zip tie showing through the fabric, especially on lighter colored corsets. I've previously also used 4mm zip ties for double boning, and that also worked well. Time to insert all of the bones. Another bone will be inserted between the layers of the back panels right at the back opening and secured by sewing another seam, trapping it in. This bone will help strengthen the eyelets. We're going to bind the top and bottom edges by sewing another strip of fabric right sides together and then folding it over the raw edge and hand sewing it down on the other side with tiny felling stitches. For the lacing, we're going to mark holes an inch apart just behind the bone and create those holes using a blunt object like we used before. Again, we're not going to want to cut the fabric to avoid fraying and ripping. I'm going to create hand-sewn eyelets since I don't have the equipment for metal grommets. Sewn eyelets were common in the 18th century and I believe even into the early Victorian era. Grommets became necessary when tight lacing gained popularity, but sewn eyelets are sturdy enough for me. We're going to use a buttonhole stitch for our little eyelets and then go over each eyelet again in whip stitches to make sure nothing frays or tears and in order to have a nice, clean finish. I'm using a contrasting green thread that will also be used for the flossing later. I forgot to film this, but I braided a long cord from 3 strands of cotton yarn for the lacing. I'm not quite sure how long I made it, but you will need about 4 yards of lacing. Time to lace up the corset. A big blunt needle is going to be very useful for this. Starting at the bottom, pass through the next higher eyelet on the other side, always going up through the eyelets from below. We're going to zigzag up the corset, and once we're about 3 eyelets in, go down the next eyelet on the same side from above before continuing to the top. Make sure to securely fasten the ends at the bottom. A quick try on of the corset as it is now without any of the flossing. For the flossing, I'm doing a floral design in olive green and dusky pink. I did think about doing black at first, but this color combination looks really nice, and I started over a few times actually, but here's what I ended up doing, inspired by this flossing example. Some V-shaped green flossing for strength, filling the space of the design as well, and coloring it in, so to speak. Kannst du die Tür schließen, Dollar? Some V-shaped green flossing for strength, filling the space of the design, coloring it in, so to speak, with thread. Some V-shaped green flossing for strength, and have a look at some V-shaped green flossing for strength, and I filled in the space between some V-shaped green flossing for strength. Have a look at my previous attempt where I just used 2 stitches compared to the improved flossing here where I've colored in the design, so to speak. Granted, it takes a lot more time, but it's really worth it. Plus, I rewatched Downton Abbey during most of it, so it didn't get boring at all. The little flowers are just decorational. Along the upper edge of the corset, I decided on just a simple green V-shaped flossing, similar to the one on the bottom, but longer. I happened to have just enough lace left to decorate the top edge, and combined with this lilac organza ribbon, the effect was perfect. I folded the lace into the ribbon, pinned it, and attached it to the corset. For a final touch, I added a bow. To the front, as shown on the original pattern I wanted to make from 1884. And the result is really amazing. And this is the final result. And this is the final result. Let me put it on so you can have a look. I really think it came out so well. It fits really well. The embroidery came out so cute, and I'm also really happy with how the colors came out, and I'm really looking forward to wearing it properly as part of a costume. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you're interested in following along on this 1870s sewing journey with me, make sure to subscribe to my channel as well. I think the next thing we'll need to do is to create a bustle petticoat, so lots of ruffles coming. As you can see, I'm working my way from the inside out on this project. Thank you so much for watching this video to the end, and I will see you next time.